So I'm going to talk about one individual. I understand it's a mouthful to say. Oh, I didn't touch anything. Marceline Rosenberg was her birth name, and it was important for her to change name after World War II, like many French Jews who changed names to blend in more with the French population. I became interested in her and her work because she is a filmmaker, and she gave various different testimonies and accounts. First in 1960, visual testimonies, I will talk about that on film. And then there was a hiatus for about 40-45 years. She made a film about her experience, a fiction film. And in the last 10 years, she's now 87, she's given many accounts. I will talk about that briefly. And those that she gave to for archival funds are pretty interesting because generally the interviewers, the historians, really want her to focus on a linear account with a chronology, and she tries as well as she can to follow that, but she's more interested in the emotions, the emotional aspect of her experience. And she's also an author because she published memoirs and an account recently, a few months, written account, narrative. So this is Marceline Loridan just before being sent to Birkenau. While her mother, 4 brothers and sisters fled through the woods of Bolène in southern France in February 1944, Marceline Rosenberg, 15 years old, was captured alongside her father by the French militia and delivered to the Gestapo. Both were sent to the prison of Avignon, then off to the transit camp of Drancy outside Paris, and eventually to Auschwitz-Birkenau in April 1944 on Convoy 71. Although she survived Birkenau, the death march to Bergen-Belsen, Leipzig and Theresienstadt, she never recovered from this past, the destruction of her family, and her father's death. This traumatic experience was to define her entire life. I quote, "I am 15 years old, the age of my trauma." Playing herself in Jean Rouche's film in 1960, Chronicle of a Summer, she stunned French audiences in the first scene in French cinema, giving voice to a Holocaust survivor recounting her experience. In a long, unscripted and unrehearsed scene, she recollected in a painful voice the heart-wrenching memories of her capture, her last encounter with the father at the camp, the lingering pain and guilt over his death, and her return to a broken family. Such a disturbing scene showing human tragedy at its rawest had been rarely, if at all, recorded on film before, and it was diversely appreciated by critics. Some questioned the authenticity of this scene, calling it a fabrication staged by the filmmaker. Others deemed it to be too poignant, too emotional, and undignified. These reactions attest to the unease felt by many facing survivors whose testimony they found unbearable and experience not to be told. These reactions obviously also reflect the lack of comprehension of the trauma felt by survivors. Marceline, now Loridan-Ivens, revisited these times in a long interview granted for the visual archival project at the Shoah Memorial in 2005 in Paris, and stated that for a very long time, no one in her family included, wanted to hear camp survivors' testimonies. She evoked the extreme difficulty felt by victims to speak up. This is a long quote. For a long time, there was this period of silence during which what I heard did not correspond at all with what I had lived. Then there was a period during which I did not want to talk or be heard. No one wanted to know, even in my own family. My uncle, who had been deported in 1942, told me, "Don't say anything, they cannot understand." As historian Annette Biébiorka demonstrates in her book Deportation and Genocide, The widespread idea that Holocaust survivors refuse to share their experience is a fallacy. Publishers quickly grew uninterested in publishing survivors' accounts, and readers lost interest in these publications. Holocaust survivors shared the sentiment that people who had not experienced deportation did not want to hear them. One should also note the disturbing fact, discussed also by Viviorka and by Rebecca Clifford in commemorating the Holocaust, that there was a favorable treatment reserved to members of the French resistance, whose memoirs and testimonies were celebrated and glorified. They were perceived as heroes who had chosen their destiny, as if there was something shameful in being a racial deportee, as if Jews were perceived as weak victims, and French Holocaust survivors felt victimized a second time. After her participation in this film in 1960, Loridan-Ivens did not speak publicly about the camps for over 40 years, and none of her work as a journalist, TV producer, filmmaker showed any reference to her past. She became engaged in many battles on the extreme left of the political spectrum. She produced, directed, and co-directed films illustrating these engagements. For example, she sided with the National Liberation Front against the French during the Algerian War. She also co-directed a film about this war, which was immediately forbidden in France and in Algeria. In the 1960s and 70s, she sided with the North Vietnamese against the Americans, spending several months with the Viet Cong and filming their life and struggles. And subsequently, she became a fervent supporter of the Chinese Cultural Revolution and spent many months, if not years, filming it and filming the life, the countryside and the cities. But since she had discovered the art of cinema, there was one film she had been longing to shoot, but felt unable to. It was a film to be about her camp experience and life after the camps. It took her 40 years to imagine the film, 10 years to complete it, and the Birch Tree Meadow translation of the word Birkenau was finally released in 2003 when she was 75 years old. She said then, "As a person, like many other survivors, I felt it was better to remain silent. But today, as an artist, I know I have the duty to express myself and add my voice to that of the people who had the courage to speak before the death of the last survivor sends the camps into the realm of history once and for all." In several interviews, she referred not only to the haunting idea of making such a film, but also to her sense of entitlement as a survivor and filmmaker, and more importantly, a wish to make a film different from all others. In her estimation, none of the films made in the past, however praiseworthy, had conveyed the images, emotions, and reflections she personally felt needed to be represented on screen. So I quote, "The idea to make a film different from what existed was born a very long time ago in my head." End of quote. Furthermore, she views cinema as the most suitable medium for representing what survivors often deem uncommunicable, because it is more apt at rendering the emotions again, beyond words, allowed to reach our souls, and in her eyes, does it in a more profound and effective way than these testimonies and literature. And I understand this would be controversial, but that's what she thinks. I quote, "One always says that between the real-life experience and other people's imaginary, there is an impassable wall. This has probably led people like Primo Levi to commit suicide. I have tried to break through this, to penetrate the soul of the spectator, oblige him perhaps to understand what escapes him, and make him live through a few characters and the nature of this place, what he could not capture when he told the story or when he reads a book. Indeed, this film is quite different from others in many surprising ways. It is not a documentary, it is a film of fiction, or I would say auto-fiction, that takes place in the contemporary era and focuses on Miriam, the Birkenau survivor, who revisits and relives the origin of her trauma by returning to the camp in an attempt to keep her memories alive, regain her repressed memory, and most of all, honor the victims of the Shoah. The Birchtree Meadow uses no reconstructed decor, has no historical reenactments, uses no historical footage, does not revert to any flashback, and is quite elliptic. No atrocities are shown visually. The retelling of the deportees' experience is done uniquely through words and overemphasized sounds, by the retelling of sensations, memories, and images that attempt to conjure all the senses. So, in the former panel, we're discussing those sounds, and so she overemphasized the sounds of nature, the wind in particular, the trees, and the train whistles. One may wonder why Loridan-Ivens decided to shoot a fiction film, since her past included such a large number of documentaries. But contrary to filmmakers like Claude Lanzmann, she considers that documentaries actually give the illusion to be objective and in fact tend to be more subjective than the public is led to believe. The film focuses first on the problematic of memory for Holocaust survivors and addresses 4 different issues: what one remembers, what one has distorted, and what one has repressed, and the unconscious memories that express themselves as physical symptoms. She echoes Primo Levi's reflection on the difficulty faced by survivors at confronting their past, as the memory of the trauma itself is traumatizing, and there's a tendency to repress it as not to renew the pain. The first memory affected is that she does not remember the sauna that all deportees invariably went through. Secondly, she carries the drawing she made of the camp wherever she goes, but the drawing is wrong. Her barracks are not where she remembered it to be. It was in fact close to the crematoria. If she remembers working at digging ditches, she does not remember digging at this location. Although everyone she has confirms that she's wrong, she's still certain that they have changed the camp. The third repressed memory is the content of the last letter that her father passed on to her in the camp. She remembers getting it, reading it several times, but has lost all recollection of its content. I quote, "I do not remember, I have never remembered it." And at the end of the film, she admits, "What if I do not want to remember?" The film also treats of the importance of transmission in a number of original ways. First of all, the filmmaker did not play the role herself, although she wrote it for herself. She used an actress to do it. She feels that it was important for her to offer the story to someone else, who by transmitting it would perhaps break through the elements of the wall she had talked about. Secondly, the transmission of memory is affected within the plot through the relationship that develops between Miriam and Oscar, the grandson of a Birkenau SS officer, a relationship that obviously introduces the theme of reconciliation. It is this German photographer who helps her acquire the global understanding of the camps that she could not have as a victim and as a child, and helps her reestablish the reality that the years and her trauma have blocked and erased. He is the one who sees the camp through her eyes and images, and who becomes the recipient of this knowledge. Ultimately, though, the achievement of the film is to require us, viewers, to become listeners, the bearers of memories, as is illustrated by Miriam's direct address to the spectators towards the end of the film. I quote, "I will never be done with this camp, and you are condemned to see through my eyes." So this film attests to the impossibility of healing from a past that never goes away, haunted by the guilt to have survived, and sadly bears witness to the obliteration of Jewish culture in countries like Poland. It nevertheless conveys a message of hope and reconciliation through the human connection between old and young, victims and their descendants, and even the descendants of those who participated in those crimes and bear a burden of responsibility but are not responsible, but who have taken upon themselves to learn about the past and keep the memory alive. So this film was followed by a large number of testimony given to the Shoah Memorial in Paris and to various medias. She actually spoke at the memorial a month ago for 2 days. And her participation in the film Like a Jew in France, and the writing her memoirs in 2008, and a few months ago, the publication of a narrative addressed to her father entitled And You Did Not Come Back, where she recounts her life after her release from the camps and gives a very sobering interpretation of the state of the world today. I hate to finish on this because she has a very pessimistic outlook on the current situation and the future, but that's what she thinks. So she has been relentless in granting provocative interviews to French media and bringing her film and other important films about the Shoah to many schools, and she's very visible in numerous public venues. But since the somewhat optimistic message conveyed by her film in 2003, all the recent interviews and her last book offer a view of the world which is quite alarming and extremely pessimistic. They also shed a doubt about her legacy and the legacy of all survivors to future generations. Loridan-Ivens did not wait until the January 2015 attacks in Paris at the Charlie and Hyper Kosher supermarket to sense that France, Europe, and the world witnessed a new wave of anti-Semitism. We should not forget that French Jews have been the target of many violent attacks since the end of the 90s. For example, they were very rare before the 90s, and I have a couple of numbers: 89 attacks in 1999, 851 in 14, and 806 last year. And they also have been the object of attacks in other European countries. Let's remember the most mediatized attacks: the assassination in cold blood of children, a parent and a teacher at the Ozar Torah school in Toulouse in 2012, or the shooting at the Jewish Museum of Brussels in 2014. Some journalists thought that Loridan-Ivens exaggerated the danger that Jews were facing in France and Europe these days because her deportation to Auschwitz gave her a pessimistic outlook on life in general. But it may be that because of her experience, she is able to recognize dangerous signs that were minimized and considered as isolated incidents committed by lost few souls. It is undeniable that attacks in France have spiked, and intellectuals, journalists, and politicians alike often refer to a new kind of anti-Semitism. But Loridan-Ivens does not perceive these attacks as anything new. Even if Jews in Europe are now protected by their governments as opposed to World War II, and she argues that they should not need to be protected, she contends that anti-Semitism is rooted both in Christian and Muslim cultures. When asked why she thinks Jews were targeted last year in Paris, she stated the following, I quote, "One should not pretend that the world has changed. It has not changed much. It is changing for the worse to the most stupid and total barbaric times. Let's not pretend not to know anything. Do you think French people would have demonstrated on the street if only Jews had been killed 2 weeks ago? No." End of quote. Another issue that has become the central point of her interviews is what she considers a dishonest and inaccurate portrayal by European media and politicians of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She considers that Israel is wrongly depicted as an occupying and colonizing power. And it's interesting because the issue of Israel did not really interest her when she was younger. She thought the issue would get resolved by itself. She was more interested in other people's struggles, but it has become now a great concern to her. She's of the opinion that Europe as a whole, filled with guilt and remorse over its colonial past, is interpreting this conflict in an outdated and inaccurate manner. Additionally, in a pernicious way, Israelis are in a certain way compared to Nazis and Palestinians to Jews during World War II. In fact, some French intellectuals have gone as far as comparing the situation of Palestinians to the one of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. Finally, Loridan-Ivens believes that anti-Semitism has been replaced by anti-Zionism. In fact, if you remember, several anti-Israeli demonstrations in France during the summer of 2014 turned quickly into violent anti-Semitic demonstrations. There was some in July 14 in Paris and in the outskirts of Sarcelles. Slogans like "Death to the Jews" were clearly heard on several occasions, which led the French government to ban some of these anti-Israeli marches that same summer, particularly when the organizers of these protests requested to march through several Jewish neighborhoods and along several synagogues. Loridan-Ivens has been advocating a change in European politics towards Israel for fear that if there is no such a change, Jews and Israelis will be annihilated in a final solution that will be acceptable and successful, because these crimes will be committed by fanatic jihadists and a coalition of Arab countries. Europe will not be held this time responsible, since the job will have been done by others. I quote, "Today, I am very worried. I cannot hide this from you. I believe that if European politics towards the Arab world does not change, it will be the Jews first, but afterwards it will be the Christians' turn, but maybe they have not understood that yet, but it will be the Jews first." As you can sense from these statements, Marceline Loridan-Ivens, now 87, has grown very pessimistic about the state of the world and the future of Jews worldwide. Additionally, she's profoundly troubled by the way some youth react to her testimonies about her experience, and fears that her work and other survivors' work will not affect them, as they show no interest in learning about the Shoah. As a matter of fact, her interviews and visits in some schools outside Paris proved to be quite contentious a year ago, as some students displayed their disapproval about her presence. Nevertheless, Marceline Loridan-Ivens will continue to have her strong voice heard, even without great illusion, and I finish with a quote from her, "in the hopes that maybe 1 or 2 persons will hear me, 1 or 2 children, that's all. But I have no illusions that something will remain in their memory."